You're watching Graves of Empire. Every chronicle on this channel is a story that history almost forgot, buried in registers, sealed behind walls, or simply left to crumble. This is one of those stories. In the wall of a small English church, there is a window no wider than a book. For over 300 years, people walk past it on their way to Mass without a second glance. But in the 13th century, a woman was sealed behind that window, alive, and a priest read her funeral rite before the mortar dried. She was not being punished, she had asked for this. To understand the Anchorite, you have to first understand a very specific kind of medieval ambition, not for power, not for wealth, but for a form of holiness, so complete it required leaving the world of the living entirely without the mercy of actually dying. An anchorite, from the Greek anachorēn, to withdraw, was a man or woman who chose permanent enclosure, not a monastery, not a convent, a single sealed cell, usually built directly against the wall of a parish church, with one small opening onto the altar and another, smaller still, facing the outside world. Once the door closed, it did not open again, not for illness, not for old age, not in most cases until death. The ritual that sealed them in was, quite deliberately, a funeral. The anchorite would be led into the cell in procession, often lying on the floor, as the priest read the office of the dead over them. The same rite read over a corpse. Earth might be scattered. The door was then bricked, boarded, or bolted shut. From that point forward, by the logic of the church and by their own understanding, the anchorite was legally and spiritually dead to the world. They took a new name in some cases. Their former identity, family, property, former life was formally renounced. They had become, in the words of the rites themselves, dead to the world and alive only to God. The cell itself was called an anchor hold, and its architecture was built around three small openings, each one governing a different relationship to the outside world. The first opening, the squint or hagioscope, faced the church's altar. Through it, the anchorite could hear Mass and receive the Eucharist without ever entering the church itself. This was the axis their entire existence was built around, uninterrupted proximity to the sacrament. The second opening faced outward, toward the world. Through this window, a servant might pass food, and townspeople might come seeking counsel or prayer. Anchorites, despite their total enclosure, often became sought-after spiritual advisors, sometimes more trusted than the parish priest himself, precisely because they had nothing left to gain from the world's approval. The third opening was smaller and far less discussed in the surviving records, a drain or a low aperture for waste. The anchor hole was not a chamber for contemplative comfort. In most surviving descriptions, it was barely larger than a grave plot, sometimes recorded as roughly the width of a man's outstretched arms and not much longer. Some anchor holds contained a small hearth, most did not. The most famous surviving guide for this life, the Anchorites, written in the early 13th century for a group of anchoresses in England, is explicit about what the cell was meant to represent. It calls the anchor hold a grave, repeatedly and without softening. To live in it was to practice dying every day for the rest of one's life. It is worth pausing on who actually chose this, because the historical record is surprisingly clear. The overwhelming majority of anchorites were women. In medieval England alone, surviving records identify several hundred anchor holds, and a clear majority of the individuals enclosed in them were anchoresses, rather than anchorites in the male sense. Some historians have argued this reflects a rare form of medieval female agency, one of the few socially sanctioned ways for a woman to control her own life, refuse marriage, and gain genuine spiritual authority, however severe the cost. The most famous anchoress in English history, Julian of Norwich lived enclosed for decades in a cell attached to St. Julian's Church in Norwich, and from that cell produced revelations of divine love, widely considered the earliest surviving book in English written by a woman. People traveled considerable distances to speak with her through the small outward-facing window of her cell. From behind stone, unable to leave, she became one of the most influential religious voices of her century. Not every enclosure ended in that kind of legacy. Most anchorites and anchoresses left no writing, no recorded voice at all. We know they existed largely through wills, bishops' registers, and church accounts, recording the small stipends left to support them. A few pence, a portion of bread, sometimes nothing at all, which meant the anchorite depended entirely on the charity of a town that could, at any point, simply stop giving. The line between voluntary enclosure and something closer to a slow-motion death sentence was not always clean. Church authorities required, at least in theory, a period of testing before permanent enclosure, a way to establish that the applicant genuinely understood what they were requesting. But the surviving guides themselves acknowledged the danger. The Ancrene Visa explicitly warns anchoresses against regret, against longing for the outside world, against the particular despair of a door that will not open again. Some accounts describe anchorites who begged, later in life, to be released, pleas that were, by the logic of the rite that had buried them, functionally impossible to grant. To leave the anchor hold was to violate a vow understood as binding before God, not merely before the church. There are documented cases of illness, of anchorites dying slowly of conditions that, outside the cell, might have been treatable. There are also documented cases of the reverse, anchorites who lived to remarkable old age, decades inside a single room, apparently sustained by the very stillness that would have destroyed someone else. What the practice reveals, more than anything, is how thoroughly the medieval world could take an act of extreme personal devotion and formalize it into an institution, complete with legal rights, architectural standards, and financial support structures, for a life that was, by any modern measure, a form of sanctioned solitary confinement lasting decades. Anchor holds survive today, mostly as blocked up doorways and strange asymmetries in old parish church walls, a stone outline where a life was once sealed away, largely unnoticed by the congregations that now sit a few feet from where someone was buried alive by their own request. We are left with an uncomfortable question the anchorites themselves would likely not have understood as a question at all. Was this devotion, or was this despair wearing devotion's clothing? The chronicles do not resolve it. Perhaps for some who entered those cells, it was both. Some doors, once closed, were never meant to open. Some people asked for that anyway. If this chronicle found you, like, subscribe, and never miss one. Graves of Empire. Every week, a story that history almost forgot.